Right. Well, what are some of the most common mistakes you see technique-wise then?
Man,
With
it's interesting in women, and I'll go straight to the point. Even on high levels, I see a lot of bend from the hips. They they compress to a certain extent, and then it's a lot of bending from the hips instead of bending the knees, and compressing more without bending from the hips. And that obviously has a huge effect on how much power you can put on your turns, how hard you can push, because if you're bending forward, and you have your torso and your head that weigh a lot, and you're too forward, then you can't push really hard because your rail is going to disengage at one point. So being compressed and bending the legs more, it's going to give you a lot more. And I tell people, hey, your legs are like a spring, like springs, or like shock absorbers, but they're springs. The more you load, the more energy comes out of them. So you got to use that to your advantage. And I give him the example of the pro surfers. Like, look at Felipe Toledo. Look how much he compresses and extends his legs, and how much energy he creates, and then speed, and force from doing that, right? So in women, I see that's kind of like a pattern, because the way they're built differently than men, So with men, it's different, but also it's like set the board on the rail, hold the rail as long as you can, transfer your weight. And also, like, I think in general, man, women, compression gets overlooked a lot, because weight distribution is super important, but compression also. And the rotation, I like to say, like, the components of rotation are 3 on your upper body, which is your arms, your shoulders, and your head. And that needs to be in unison. There needs to be follow through, right? And I use the example of the tennis swing or the golf swing, even baseball. You don't hit a tennis, you don't go back and hit it and stop, right? You swing through, and all of a sudden the tennis racket's pointing the other way and the ball's going that way. Tennis racket's pointing that way. Why? Because if you stop the motion, even though the contact's already happened and the ball left the surface of the racket, that follow through, it's very important to not cut that motion, and to kind of, it's like extension of all that energy of that movement, So I use a lot of martial arts, kicks, punching, all this stuff, and how you use your hips, how you use all this momentum and all this body mechanics to create a full, complete movement. And for men, I feel like sometimes, because they're a little bit more aggro generally, but not on all cases, they want to they want to throw a lot more spray. They just they cut the flow because they're cutting turns short. So a lot of the times is, let's work on holding that rail longer, keep the board on the rail, because if the board's on the rail, you're going to be able to push longer, harder, because it's not only the fins holding you in the water, it's also the rail. Also, the boards with the rocker, if they're flat, they don't project, they're going to spin like that. But if they're on the rail and that line, the rocker, the bottom can turn, that's what's going to create projection. That creates a more amplitude on your turns. The turn looks bigger, more, it just looks better, right? So it's kind of like, let's understand the mechanics of the surfboard, of surfing, of the face of the wave, of the right turn for the right section with the right amount of speed that you need to do that turn on that section. And then let's apply it to it, and let's see how it feels, right? And then also, the rotation, the weight shifting, the compression at the end of it. But I'm like, those are things that I'm like, like, if you don't reload, if you don't compress on the bottom turn, then you're leaving energy and speed behind that you're not using, right? And then if you're not recoiling your back leg before you turn, then you're not going to have enough. It's like trying to push from here or push from here. You're going to have more force behind it, the more recoiling there is. And also, but there's so much stuff to it, all these aspects, so that's why surfing is so hard, and then put the board on the rail, then look over your shoulder, then start pressing gradually, then shift your weight, then finish, your turn. So hence, it's not easy to teach, right? Or even to do it yourself.
Yeah, that's why surfing's the hardest sport in the world for sure. So, hey, yeah, and that breakdown and that advice is really useful. And so how do you, get people to make these changes in their technique, right? Like compressing. Everybody knows mentally, or a lot of people know mentally, I need to compress more. But like, how do you actually get Shakti or one of your clients to compress more? Does it go back to, what you mentioned where, you have a note, on your surfboard or anything like that? Or they're just like, you go out, how do you get your students to make these actual adjustments? I think that's always the hard part. People know mentally they need to make changes, but then, for the example, like cutting your turn short, that's a very common issue, right? How do you get them to change that?
Well, two things, like with the compression, and the first compression starts on the bottom turn, right? So if you want to start there, if it's backside is a little trickier, but there's ways to do it with your arm placement, your hands placement. If you're doing a backside bottom turn and your back hand is high, then it's not going to help you compress. But if you bring that hand lower towards the rail of your board, like if you were going to grab it, but you don't need to grab it, but bring it lower, it's going to help you compress more. It's going to feel more natural to want to get that compression, bend more the knees. Obviously, your front hand needs to be that like pivoting like hand where you're going to pivot around. And front side, it's instead of, you see a lot of that wind up, right? On the back arm going like that. But truthfully, when you have a bigger canvas and you do that, you're not being efficient with your projection of the face, because as soon as you do that and you decompress, that's it. You're not going to accelerate that much more. But if your front arm, it's bent, and instead of touching the water on your bottom turn, you bend the arm and you want to put forearm on the water, that's going to help you need to get lower, because then your arm's too high. If you want to have that elbow and that forearm closer to water, you're going to have to bend your knees more. And that, if you hold that compression like that, as you come off the bottom, it's going to do that slingshot effect up the face. So obviously it takes a lot of practice, and there's things you can do outside of the water, certain squatting, lunges, like all these different exercises, jumps, and all this stuff that it's going to help, because like ultimately the repetitions was going to create that new habit. And if you don't do it on land, it's going to be really hard for you to do it in the water, when how many ways do you catch in a session, all the distractions, all the things. But on land, you can do, 100 squats or 100 reps of anything that you want to work on like that in a few minutes. So you gotta understand how the brain works, to create a new habit, repetition. And how many times, how many hours does it take? In Pilates, they said that neurological and neuromuscular connection takes more or less 4 or 5 hours, to engage the pelvic floor. Right? Try that when you haven't done it in the first 3 hours. You're like, pelvic floor, what are you talking about? But then through practice and repetition, all of a sudden, that connection gets established. And then it's like, oh, I can actually engage the pelvic floor. I didn't even know it existed for 30 years. You know what I mean? So
never heard about anybody. Yeah, I've never heard about anybody talk about pelvic floor in relation to surfing. That's fascinating.
Well, that's Pilates, and I don't really use that, but that's like, that's a scientific,
right.
Proven point that you need certain amount of repetition to actually create a new habit, certain amount of hours doing something to create a new habit. And if not only you're creating a new habit, you're actually changing an old habit. So it's not easy. So it takes a lot of, focus, repetition, proper technique. I see a lot of people like using the skateboards, and I use them with some of my clients. Surski, Carver, you call it, all these really good like boards that are out there to correct your technique. But like one thing I say is like, if you go out and you are doing exactly what you do in the water on the skateboard, then all you're going to do is cement that habit that you want to change. So it's not going to do you any good. Make sure you're doing it properly first, and then repeat yourself. Make sure you know that those repetitions are the proper technique, the proper posture, and then repeat them until you create the new.
Right. Like they say, what is it? You don't want imperfect, I forget how it goes. It's like imperfect practice is just going to, you practice the wrong thing over and over again, you're just going to get worse, right? You have to practice perfectly. You got to figure out what the perfect technique is, and then you practice it, and that's actually how you get good. And I think that's what you're saying.